And I'm going to turn it over to Airic.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rachel, for having me, and thank you to Shiloh Museum for the invitation to come and share. I would like this to be an engaging event this evening, where I like to call this in a sense, an Afrofuturist type of educational event. We're going to take a look at the past, and we're going to talk about the Black experience in Springdale tonight, but we're also going to hopefully engage in some new creations about what this Black experience in Springdale should look like. All right. So first of all, thank you again to Shiloh Museum for the opportunity to come and speak. As Rachel mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate in the history department at the University of Arkansas. My research examines Interstate 630. And when I say Black geographies, I'm basically examining how interstate development shapes the social constructions of urban society, how Black and brown communities are placed in different areas, and then that is cemented through federal developments like interstate constructions. And so with that being said, I am an American historian. I am a Southern historian, but I'm not an Ozark historian, right? So what I wanted to do with this evening is provide some real education on the Black experience here in Northwest Arkansas. And we're going to take a focus in Springdale, largely because we're working with Shiloh Museum. But what I wanted to do is to give some real hands-on data and information, and even as we'll see some interesting stories and artifacts about the real Black experience here in Springdale, Arkansas. And so with that being said, I would like to just start with when I received this invitation to speak here at Shiloh, and I started doing some research into the Black experience in Springdale. I ran across one of this photo that you see in the background on the Washington County Historic Society site. And one of the things that was most notable to me immediately was that if you look in the middle of the photo, directly to the center of the people standing in the doorway, there's a Black man standing right in the middle of this photo. And so I asked my wife, I told my wife, I said, does this man look Black to you? And she said, yeah. And so I started to look in the rest of the photo, and even on the left side, you see more Black people. And whether they're Black or brown is difficult to tell, but they are obviously not white people, because there are white people in the photo on the right side that you can obviously compare to. And this got me thinking, like, who are these people? What are they doing in Springdale? And what are they doing in Springdale at that time? And so hopefully the conversation that we have tonight will give some context to this experience that African Americans have had in Northwest Arkansas, and particularly here in Springdale. So with that being said, I just click through?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. There we go. So with that being said, we're going to start our conversation this evening talking about some of the information that is available right here at the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History concerning the African-American experience. And even we'll talk about some of the potential misconceptions about the Black experience here in Springdale. I'm originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, and in moving here to Northwest Arkansas, Springdale was one of the first places that I actually lived. And when I came, Springdale had a certain reputation, especially for African Americans. And so we're going to talk a little more about that tonight. And so with that, we'll talk a little more with Rachel Whitaker about some of the information that Shiloh Museum has about the Black experience here in Springdale.
All right. So when Airic and I were discussing this program, one of the things that we talked about is the question that we get about sundown towns specifically. There is a long tradition, an oral tradition that Springdale itself was a sundown town. And that's a little more complicated, but we want to address first that even if it isn't a sundown town, that doesn't mean that there was not prejudice, there was not racial tensions, there were not things that were going on that were wrong. It just means that there wasn't the sign on the ends of town that everybody thinks existed. So one of the things that you have to look at whenever you're considering sundown towns, and James Lowen is the one who wrote the book on sundown towns, and he's one of the first people who really puts it out there that Springdale is a sundown town. And he doesn't look at the census data. And a sundown town will say that there are no African Americans, there's no Black people, there's no people of color who live in that town. And when you look at the census data, there are Black people who live in Springdale, going back into the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, into the 1900s. And Lowen doesn't look any farther back than the 1930s. And these people were here, they were carpenters, they were servants. So while it may not be a sundown town, they could be calling it a gray town, however, because they're trying to whitewash. There are newspaper articles, there's postcards, there's brochures. There was even a sign one time that might have said that we don't have malaria, we don't have mosquitoes, and we don't have Negroes. So they are trying to whitewash the existence of the town, but it's not a sundown town because there's no city ordinances. There's no removal of the African American body from here. They're just trying to say, no, they're not really here. Don't see them. Don't acknowledge their presence. So that's one of the big things that we have to talk about when we talk about Springdale's history.
How long? Well, you said since the 1880s or 1870s, there's records of an African American presence here. And so, with these Black people engaging in these different activities, what are some of the records of what their lived experience was like during these early years?
So we have people who we have the story of the two young boys who were hunting probably together. It's one Black child and one white child who were hunting together in the woods, and the Black child accidentally shot, and that was about the 1890s, early 1890s. And he accidentally shot the white child. And the accounts in the newspaper immediately say that he went and he hid and he tried to cover it up. But when they started investigating the issue, no, he actually went and tried to get help immediately. And then he went home to wait for the authorities and did exactly what he was supposed to do. But then a few years later, another gentleman who was working on the railroads, which was probably what drew a lot of Black people into this area, was labor. But he died under mysterious circumstances along the railroad tracks. And the circumstances, I won't go into the details because they're pretty grisly, but the circumstances of his death were very mysterious. And they held an inquisition to determine whether or not they should have the coroner come in and do an autopsy, or if they were just going to rule this an accident. And the grand jury decided, no, we're going to go ahead and say this is an accident, and we're not going to have any kind of hearing. And so it was very odd that the immediate response was, in the one case, this kid tried to cover it up when it was a very obvious accident. But then whenever you have this very clear, mysterious circumstances, right. So but you have carpenters, you have blacksmiths, you have servants in the households who are working, they're taking care of the children, they're, washing the laundry, and they're living right alongside the white people in the community, and the Native Americans that are still here in the community. So
that's interesting. So going into, let's say, during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, as the onset of the 20th century began, we were talking about some of these experiences that African Americans had here in Northwest Arkansas. A lot of those are related to labor. But what are some of the experiences, or what are some things that you can pull, or that you have pulled from the archives, to talk about what Black life was like as the 20th century kind of went further into the 20th century?
So I have one article from the 1930s. That's there was a gentleman who came into Springdale, and he was traveling. He was walking alongside the road, and it was getting really late, and he had been traveling for a long time. And I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with the Green Book. And Springdale obviously was not listed among the places that was safe to stay in the Green Book. Fayetteville was. They had some places in Fayetteville. But he decided that it was safer for him to sleep alongside the road than to try and find accommodations in town. But the police officers come along and they actually picked him up and took him to the jail cell for the night. And, I don't know if you guys can see that, but he and it was for his own safety. When you read the actual article, it was for his own safety because it was a cold night and they were worried somebody might run over him because he really was laying on the side of the road. And that was before we had wide shoulders and different things. So it was a lot more dangerous to sleep alongside the road. But and this pops up not only in the Springdale news, but in the Fayetteville news. But as you can see from the headline, if you could see it, it says Negro held in jail here Friday night. So the headline kind of has that bias already built into it, saying, like they had arrested him. And really all it was these police officers had actually taken him in for his own safety. And then they took him out the next day and, said, here you go, go on your way and you're fine. And so obviously that also calls into question the whole sundown town.
Absolutely.
Because they're not running him out of town immediately. They took him in for his own safety. So,
and I think that speaks also to what you were referring. Overall, it seems that with the Black experience, there's a complex relationship with the city of Springdale, where there's this effort to whitewash the Black presence, but then there's also these stories that come out in the newspaper where the Black presence that is there is almost demonized in a sense, even with innocent activity like finding somewhere to sleep on the side of the road.
Right. And I mean, there were signs, there were brochures and stuff in all over in Northwest Arkansas that would say, the KKK welcomes you. So we know that relationship is there. We know that complication is there. We're not trying to say that Springdale was not having those moments at all. We're just saying that it's a lot more complicated. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And that it's not always as clear cut as what one way or the other.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what we do as historians.
Right.
Is what you and I have
it's what
done
we
for
do.
Years,
Yeah, we've been doing this
across the table, adding nuance to these conversations. So I'm glad to have this opportunity to share some information, some data on the early Black experience here in Northwest Arkansas. Were there any other stories or any interesting tidbits that you came across in the archives while you were doing this quick research? And before you share, this should be a plug for everyone out there to come to Shiloh Museum to take on more interest in these stories. But we'll talk more about that as we get to latter parts of the presentation. But was there anything else interesting that stood out to you?
So we found we're also working on another project for something else here at the museum, and our director had been to the Mosaic Templars and was looking at some of the fraternal orders that might be here, and she had asked me if I would look into some stuff, and we found that as early as the 19-teens that there was a African American Boy Scout troop in Fayetteville, not specifically Springdale, but in Fayetteville. And then we also found out that there was a African American lodge. So when you guys start talking about like the Masons and the Independent Order of the Oddfellows and stuff like that, we also have the Order of the Mysterious 10 in Fayetteville. So, we're finding these little stories. They're buried in there, and that's part of that whitewashing that we've talked about, that it's harder to dig into these stories. And that's one of the things that we're wanting to do, is pull those stories out and find those stories. And it's a little bit harder because they did a really good job of whitewashing the history.
Yeah, absolutely. And with just the understanding that there were Black organizations here, there were, scout groups here, there were fraternal organizations that speaks to the presence of African Americans here in Springdale and in Northwest Arkansas. But it also shows that despite this whitewashing or this larger effort to try to diminish their presence, there's still a lively community. There's still all types of activity going on. And so this is a part of Springdale that I never knew about. And I'm sure many Arkansans overall and people at large don't have an understanding of this deep history that Black people have here in Springdale.
Right.
So yeah, is there any interesting questions or comments that we can pull from the chat maybe about some of these stories or about these early experiences. I'm sure you might have some people who might be informed in the audience. If so, you can leave those in the chat, or please feel free to share. But if we want to move forward, we can.
Okay.
It's not a problem. So with that being said, I'll take this. When I said this is going to be an Afrofuturist event, and from the standpoint of we're going to take a look at the past, we're going to pivot and take a look at the current Black experience, as well as consider what the future of the Black experience in Springdale could or should be, right? So with that being said, one of the reasons that, I'm interested to lead this conversation and happy to work with Shiloh Museum on this conversation tonight is because of what I do in one of my jobs. I teach at the University of Arkansas, but I'm also an entrepreneur, and I own Visionairi Enterprises. That's an organization here in Northwest Arkansas, and we focus on Black culture preservation. We do that in 3 focus areas. We do that in areas of film and media, education, and social justice. Some of the examples of things that we do include programs like you see here listed. But overall, all of the work that we do is focused on making space for Blackness and for the Black experience. So in film and media, we work with organizations like the Fayetteville Film Festival to expand opportunities for filmmakers of color. In education, of course, I teach, but on the campus where primarily Visionairi does a lot of our work, we do a weekly Black book list where we highlight Black authors and Black educators. And our students, we have student interns from the university campus. They requested more space to talk about these Black writers. And so we created a book club called the Footnotes Book Club. And this is probably one of the largest Black book clubs on the university campus. And in the areas of social justice, we do work in areas of art and in areas of community building. And so some of the programs that you see listed here are Incarcerated. That's a program where we highlight art from incarcerated individuals, and we focus on the story of one of my business partners, Kenneth Reams, who is an incarcerated artist here in Arkansas. And so Kenneth and I go into these different communities and share the art that he has created and other incarcerated artists have created, and they all focus on capital punishment, social justice issues, mass incarceration, things like that. And so Kenneth and I work together with some community organizations here in Northwest Arkansas to create a youth intervention program called Incarcerated with Purpose. And so the reason I'm sharing about this info with you is because this is some of the work that Visionairi actually does here in Springdale. Incarcerated with Purpose is one of the programs that I'll tell you a little more about. But we work with several organizations, or have worked with several organizations based here in Springdale in the past. We've worked with Arkansas Support Network. We help to provide media and accessibility for their media content. And we also worked with a Black-owned business called Straight White Boxing and Fitness here in Springdale. And the program that I mentioned to you a moment ago, Incarcerated with Purpose, we were able to deliver in a youth intervention format at the Archer Learning Center here in Springdale. And so as you can see in the graphic, and what I'll show you in this image or in this graphic is some of the art that these young people were able to create right here in Springdale, Arkansas. And it's all focused on introspection. It's focused on trying to get them to see a new version of themselves, because we are working with in most cases at-risk youth, and that's the target for that program. And so this is some of the work that Visionairi is doing in Springdale currently. And I would like to take this opportunity now to pivot and talk about some of the other communities, organizations, and institutions that are helping to maybe shape and reshape this Black experience in Springdale currently. So at this time, maybe we can open it up for some individuals who can talk about maybe some community organizations. I know the MLK Council is doing a lot of work here in Springdale, Arkansas. But what are some other communities, organizations, and institutions that are helping to shape this Black experience in Springdale?
And you guys can turn on your microphones at this point. You don't have to just post in the chat. Thanks, Kathleen. I don't know if you guys can see this. Historically, it's important to note the Nelson Hackett project that Shiloh presented on and the Washington County Remembrance Project.
Yeah.
the Nelson Hackett project was presented last February by Dr. Pierce from the university. I think we both have had him at the university. And then the Washington County Remembrance Project.
And that's another organization that we have worked with here in Northwest Arkansas concerning the Black experience. We were actually able to work with them to document the marker that was placed at Oak Cemetery for those 3 African-American men who were lynched in Fayetteville. So with the current knowledge that we have about the Black experience in Springdale, and maybe even with revisiting some of this information that we've learned tonight and potentially with more research here in the archives, I would like to even open it up for the chat to talk about some of the ways that we can better shape the Black experience in Springdale. And one of the things that most immediately comes to my mind is the fact that we don't know a lot about this experience, and this information that's available in Shiloh, I think has a lot of opportunity to help with the growth overall here in Springdale, because this is an opportunity for more people to come and learn about this history, particularly about the history of African Americans here in Springdale. So with that being said, are there any upcoming exhibits or any upcoming plans that you could potentially speak to about ways that we could highlight this Black experience and reshape this Black experience, maybe with Shiloh or with the community?
So one of the things that we're trying to do here at Shiloh right now is obviously with Ozark history, which is what we're focused on here, is you get a lot of white history and the history's been whitewashed a lot, but we know, even though there are little tidbits that we're having to pull out here and there are people of color in this area. There's also women's voices, there's people that are disabled, there's all kinds of other groups in the area. So it's not just the Black experience, but we are trying to build a more diverse and inclusive narrative of the experience in Northwest Arkansas. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is collect those stories. We're trying to make sure that we have artifacts that are representational, or photographs. I work in the photograph library right now. And that's one of the hardest things for us to do, is find photographs of African Americans or Native Americans or Latinos or any other disenfranchised or minority group, because a lot of the people that kept stuff and brought stuff to us were white, because that's who felt like they could bring that in. And so one of the things we want to do is also make ourselves, I guess, an ally where we can help collect those stories and we can help store that knowledge, because 100 years from now, somebody may not have access to the same resources that I have access to. And I was still pulling just a lot of the information I was pulling out was a sentence on a full page. It wasn't, I'm not reading entire stories. I'm reading a sentence on a full page to get the information I'm getting. So those are the big things that we're trying. That's the grand things that we're trying to do. Some of the other things we're doing, we do have that exhibit, the digitization exhibit that's coming up, where we're going to have, one of the things that we're pushing for is having images where people can see themselves in the images. And so we want a larger representation of the population in our images. And so we don't want just the token representation. We're trying to make sure that we have more than one person, or we're trying to make sure that we're covering a diverse group in that one. And then as we go forward, we're going to continue with that pattern. So it's a process, and sadly it's come to, it has to be a process, because we haven't done things that way in the past, and our collections weren't done that way. But we are trying to make a good faith effort to move forward. And so, yes, bring us your stories.
No, absolutely.
Bring us your photos. I want to see your photos. I love seeing the photos. That's one of the the best things that I get to do in my job is I get to see the photos of people's lives, and you get to start with like their baby pictures and you go all the way through their life, and you get to see, you know, births, marriages, you know, maybe a divorce, or, you know, college, or, you know, children and grandchildren and Christmases, and, you know, their puppies, and, you know, it's just this fabulous experience. And I wish we could tell more of those stories with what we're doing here, and not just a whitewashed version. So.
Well, one thing I will say is I know absolutely, it seems like we have some comments in the chat as well, but there are a rich variety of African-American experiences that are not being properly told. Mm-hmm. And not just here in Springdale, right. There's a rich Black experience in Fayetteville that right. has been chronicled on some levels. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are a lot of opportunities to take what we have now as a platform to shape this new knowledge and the refocus that we have to say, how can we better tell these mm-hmm. stories? How can we tell more fuller stories mm-hmm. and actually begin to really embrace diversity here mm-hmm. in Springdale and in Northwest Arkansas overall by using this history and highlighting this experience to promote more people of color right. to come to this area.
Right.
So hopefully, let's see what we have in the chat. Maybe we got some comment. Oh, sorry.
Wow.
Yeah, no, for sure. These are definitely some good organizations. The Northwest Arkansas Black-owned Business Expo that's occurring in Springdale. I know Visionairi is planning to be there in attendance for that. Let me see what else. Sorry. It says there's a growing population of Afro-Latinx individuals, particularly from Puerto Rico, bringing with them different experiences mm-hmm. from the Black communities who have a long history here in America. How do you think they add nuance to the Black experience in Springdale and Northwest Arkansas at large? That's actually a great question. Rachel and I were talking about that as we were doing a tour of the exhibits. We were talking about the way Shiloh has really taken strides toward making their exhibits more accessible. But we were having a conversation about, okay, so what does this actually look like as far as even expanding the language offerings, but even in consideration mm-hmm. about these different, more niche experiences mm-hmm. That are certainly present and have been present here this entire time in Springdale and in Northwest Arkansas. So I think that's a good way to even add some further complications to how this experience is shared here through Shiloh Museum and really in Springdale right. overall by taking these deeper dives.
Right. No, I think this is a really good question. And also for accessibility purposes, like we were talking about, this adds to that conversation, especially because we're looking at some different technologies for dealing with that. Because translation costs are a little fun, but also making our narratives
absolutely
available and engaging on different levels,
on deeper levels.
Yeah, on deeper levels, but mm-hmm. but where it's relevant not just to one group, but to all groups.
Absolutely. Thank you for that comment. Let's see if we have anything else. Since the University of Arkansas is holding Common Ties Conference this week, okay, for social studies teachers. 2 Springdale High School teachers are attending, yes. Mm-hmm. And
I know Robert Turner.
Okay, yeah. And I was just gonna share that I know the Springdale school system was very positive and forward thinking with their relationship with what we were trying to accomplish with Incarcerated with Purpose. And so I'm hoping that, we can take this as a time to figure out, okay, in our individual lanes, whether it's in education, whether it's in the business sector, whether it's in, tourism or any of these different areas, how can we better engage the Black experience, Black communities, but also use that to make this a more inclusive space overall. I love hearing comments like this because that's really what we try to do with Visionairi and accomplish here with that. Let's see. What does historical research reveal about lynching in Springdale or Northwest Arkansas more broadly? That's a great question.
So Springdale, I haven't found any yet. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I always want to qualify my statements with, I haven't found it yet.
Absolutely.
Because as a historian, as a historian, I will always say that. And as a librarian, I will always say that. Just because I haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So far, I haven't found a whole lot for lynching in Springdale. However, lynching, as we learned and discussed in our African American history class with Dr. Wayne, doesn't necessarily mean specifically with a rope. There are other ways of lynching, and there are other laws, and there are other forms of penalizing people of color specifically, and there are instances in Northwest Arkansas and in Springdale. In Fayetteville, we have the documentation for what was, I don't even like to say it, but what was called Tin Cup. It was a community in Fayetteville, and there is a city plan for Fayetteville to remove the entire community because they wanted to. It was part of an urban renewal process at the early mid-century. There are other instances of people being run out of town in Northwest Arkansas. We cover 6 counties in Northwest Arkansas. So there's Harrison, there's entire communities that are wiped out. Cincinnati, Lincoln, Cane Hill, some of those communities were specifically African American communities.
Wow.
And today, and today they had large population centers that were African American specifically, and you would not see that today when you went to those communities. They're not. You see them more in Fayetteville, Bentonville, our urban centers today. But back then, you would have seen them more in Cane Hill and Lincoln and Summers, Cincinnati, those places. So, so just the removal process itself is
absolutely
there. It's very evident. The lynching that we at the Oak Cemetery. There's also the anti-horse thief. We have photographs, and they're kind of a night riders, which is when the KKK was made illegal. So there are other organizations that we know about that were aliases for the KKK.
Right.
So again, the history is a lot more nuanced that you can say, oh, the KKK doesn't exist. Well, but do you have these other groups that are kind of masquerading
with the same goals?
And they're specifically looking for people that are other in some way. And so we have photographs. And that's what I work with. I also work with the research files. I work with the library. So yes, there is a lot. It's just not specifically stringing somebody up by their neck or their toes. But it's there.
And even the violence of displacement is something that I wouldn't necessarily associate with Northwest Arkansas, but to hear that there are Black people in cities like Lincoln kind of makes sense to me from a historical standpoint, just from the name association. But then to think about why we don't think that there are Black people there now, like that's still a form of this violence against Black communities, and ultimately this displacement, and like you were mentioning before, this whitewashing of the overall Black experience here, because that's something that's really revealing, is that there were a lot of Black people here, obviously, So with that being said, do we have any further questions or any further ideas about how to better shape the Black experience in Springdale? I won't belabor it, but I think we did cover a lot of good potential opportunities. One thing I will say is I will encourage everybody to come here to Shiloh Museum of the Ozarks. You're going to learn a lot, first of all, but then second of all, there's a lot of opportunities to connect with this space as a community institution, right? And I think that that's another way that we can reshape the Black experience here in Springdale, is by utilizing this space as a community resource, right? So that's definitely something that I'm excited about for not only myself, but hopefully for the growth here in the city and the growth in Northwest Arkansas overall. One of the things that, like I said before, Visionairi prides itself on is making space for Blackness. And so this has been a really interesting talk for me because I've learned a lot about what Black life was actually like here in Northwest Arkansas, what it was like here in Springdale. And I'm hoping that that encourages more people not only to come and learn about the Black experience here in Springdale, but to really just rethink like how we can better make our spaces more inclusive and more accessible to all communities by thinking about, okay, what is their experience like here in this same place? So I hope it was a good
I'm really excited to see what we can do going forward. And I really appreciate you coming and talking with everybody tonight, Airic.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, anytime. Are there any other questions or comments? I'm going to open it back up one more time before we close out.
Has the University of Arkansas members to and in Black life in Springdale more broadly? Oh, there's a Black-owned wrestling school in Springdale.
Nice.
See, this is why I wanted people to add these to the chats, so more people can learn about the organizations that are doing work here in Northwest Arkansas. Because what I definitely want to do is use this as a space to highlight other Black organizations that are doing the work here, that are boots on the ground. And so I'm definitely excited to see that we even have Black wrestling organizations here in Springdale. I want to address that one. Let's see, Black life in Springdale. So I think that's actually a good question. From my perspective, when I hear about the desire for more stories, the University of Arkansas is a treasure trove of the Black experience here in Fayetteville and in Northwest Arkansas overall. I know there are groups on campus like the Black Alumni Society that have a long documented history and have really kept great, not just stories, but documentation of the Black presence on the University of Arkansas campus. And so I think that the University of Arkansas is a great resource to try to add more of those, that fuller experience to Shiloh. But then I think there are other community institutions in Fayetteville, particularly places like the different churches or religious organizations that may have historical evidence. There are different community organizations that also have a long historical record of doing work in Northwest Arkansas. So I definitely think the campus as well as other community institutions are fruitful places to try to make those connections and share those stories.
Right.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, if we don't have, all right. Thank you.
Cool.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think I'm going to go ahead and close this out unless you've got anything else.
I got one I can share. The last thing I would like to share is where to contact how to stay in communication. I can't get the technology to work right though. There we go. So yeah, I definitely want to send a thank you to Shiloh Museum again. And if you all are interested in learning more about what we do with the Visionairi Foundation, you can find out more on our website, www.truevisionary.com. And then we're everywhere on social media at Visionairi. And again, I just want to give a big thank you to Shiloh Museum for the invitation. And everybody come to Shiloh, learn about the Black experience here, the real Black experience here in Northwest Arkansas.
Thank you so much, Airic.